March 30th, 1867. The United States acquires 586,412 square miles of land for $7.2 million. That's roughly 2 cents per acre. Today, Alaska contains an estimated 190 billion in natural resources: oil, gold, timber, natural gas reserves that could power entire nations. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. Russia didn't sell Alaska because they were generous. They sold it because they were drowning. The transaction wasn't a real estate deal. It was a financial execution, an imperial fire sale conducted while the Russian Empire teetered on the edge of collapse. And the United States didn't just happen to be there with cash in hand. They were waiting. So here's the question. How do you convince an empire to sell 1/5 of its territorial claims for less than the cost of a single warship? The answer reveals a pattern of geopolitical opportunism that shaped the modern world and is still playing out today. His name was William H. Seward, Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, a man history remembers as the architect of American expansion. But in 1867, most Americans thought he was insane. Seward grew up in upstate New York, the son of a physician. He was educated, ambitious, and believed in something called manifest destiny, the idea that America was meant to stretch from ocean to ocean and perhaps beyond. He became a lawyer, then a governor, then a senator. By the time he joined Lincoln's cabinet, Seward had developed a singular obsession: territorial expansion. Not through war, but through strategic acquisition. He believed the future of American power depended on controlling resource-rich land before European empires could claim it. Alaska was always part of that vision. But Seward understood something most politicians didn't. You don't buy land when someone wants to sell it. You buy it when they have to sell it. And in the 1860s, Russia had to sell. Seward wasn't a villain. He was a strategist. He saw the chessboard clearly. He understood that empires don't collapse all at once. They hemorrhage slowly, selling off pieces of themselves to survive. His fatal flaw wasn't cruelty. It was patience. He could wait for crisis. He could smell desperation across an ocean. And in 1867, Russia reeked of it. To understand why Russia sold Alaska, you need to understand the Crimean War. From 1853 to 1856, Russia fought a coalition of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire over control of the Black Sea. Russia lost, badly. The war cost Russia over 500,000 casualties. It destroyed their economy. It exposed their military as technologically backward. It shattered the myth of Russian invincibility. But the real damage wasn't on the battlefield. It was financial. Russia had borrowed heavily to fund the war, from European banks, from private investors. The empire was drowning in debt it couldn't repay. Here's how the mechanism worked. Russia's economy depended on agricultural exports: grain, timber, furs. But after the Crimean War, trade routes were disrupted. European markets turned hostile. The currency collapsed. Imagine you own a house worth $500,000, but you owe $600,000 on it, and your income just dropped by half, and the bank is calling. That was Russia in 1867. Alaska, from Moscow's perspective, was a liability. It was 5,000 miles away, impossible to defend. The fur trade, Alaska's only real revenue source, was collapsing due to overhunting. The region required military garrisons that Russia could no longer afford to maintain. And here's the critical detail. Britain controlled Canada, directly adjacent to Alaska. If war broke out again, and everyone assumed it would, Britain could simply take Alaska. Russia would lose the territory anyway, without compensation. So the calculation was simple: sell now for something, or lose it later for nothing. But there was another layer to this. The United States had just emerged from its civil war. It was cash poor, but resource hungry. It needed land. It needed legitimacy as a continental power. And most importantly, it was not Britain. Russia despised Britain. Selling Alaska to the United States wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a geopolitical middle finger. It blocked British expansion. It created a buffer state on the Pacific. From Russia's perspective, the sale was strategic retreat. From America's perspective, it was opportunistic expansion. But neither side could admit the truth publicly, so they called it a purchase. The Alaska Territory in 1867 was home to approximately 50,000 indigenous people: Tlingit, Aleut, Inuit, Yupik. They had lived there for thousands of years. Nobody asked them about the sale. Russian officials informed native leaders through translators that they now belonged to the United States. The land, the resources, the rivers, everything had been transferred. One Tlingit leader reportedly asked the Russian governor, "How can you sell what you do not own?" There was no answer. For Russian fur traders living in Alaska, the sale was a betrayal. Many had spent decades building settlements. They had married indigenous women. They had children born on that land. Ivan Petrov, a Russian clerk stationed in Sitka, kept a diary during the transition. He wrote, "We are being discarded like old furniture, sold to a foreign power as if we were inventory." Petrov stayed in Alaska after the sale. He worked as a translator for the U.S. government. He died in poverty in 1896. For American prospectors and settlers, Alaska was a frozen wasteland. Newspapers called it Seward's Folly. Political cartoons depicted Seward buying icebergs and polar bears. Critics argued the money could have been spent on post-war reconstruction. One congressman called the purchase a dark deed done in the dark. The Senate ratified the treaty by a single vote. But here's what nobody understood at the time. Alaska wasn't valuable for what it was in 1867. It was valuable for what it would become. In 1896, gold was discovered near the Klondike River, just across the Alaskan border. The ensuing gold rush brought 100,000 prospectors north. In 1968, oil was discovered at Prudhoe Bay, the largest oil field in North America, worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Every resource Russia needed to stabilize its economy, gold, oil, timber, fish, was buried in the land they sold for $7.2 million. By the time Russia realized the true value, it was too late. The transaction was irreversible. The Alaska sale wasn't a collapse in the traditional sense. There was no stock market crash, no bank run, no violent revolution, not yet, but it marked a turning point in Russian imperial decline. Here's how the dominoes fell. In 1867, Russia sells Alaska for immediate cash. The $7.2 million provides temporary relief, but solves nothing structurally. In 1877, Russia enters another war with the Ottoman Empire. More debt, more casualties. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II is assassinated. Political instability intensifies. In 1905, Russia loses a war to Japan, a humiliation that triggers the First Russian Revolution. In 1917, the empire collapses entirely. The Romanov dynasty ends. The Soviet Union rises from the wreckage. At each stage, the pattern is the same: territorial overreach, financial exhaustion, strategic retreat. Alaska was the first major amputation. But what's critical to understand is this: the United States didn't cause Russia's collapse. They simply exploited it. Seward understood that empires in decline make desperate decisions. They sell assets at distressed prices. They prioritize short-term survival over long-term strategy. And if you're patient enough, if you can wait for the crisis, you can acquire generational wealth for pennies on the dollar. This wasn't unique to Alaska. In 1803, the United States bought the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million. Napoleon needed cash to fund his wars. America doubled its size overnight. In 1819, Spain ceded Florida to the United States because it could no longer afford to defend it. In 1848, Mexico sold California and the Southwest after losing a war it couldn't afford to fight. The pattern repeats: financial crisis, territorial loss, American expansion. Alaska was just the most absurd example. Because Russia didn't lose a war to America, they didn't even negotiate from weakness in the traditional sense. They simply looked at their balance sheet and made a calculation: we can't afford this anymore. And Seward was there, checkbook ready. William H. Seward died in 1872, 5 years after the Alaska Purchase. He never lived to see the gold rush. He never saw the oil fields, but he knew. In his final years, Seward traveled to Alaska personally. He visited Sitka, met with indigenous leaders, inspected the territory. He told a journalist, "Give it 50 years, then ask me if this was folly." In Russia, the sale became a source of national shame. When the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, Soviet historians rewrote the narrative. They blamed Tsar Alexander II for betraying the people. They argued Alaska should never have been sold. Some Soviet officials even proposed buying it back. In 1940, during World War II, Stalin reportedly joked to an American diplomat, "Perhaps we should renegotiate the Alaska deal." Adjusted for inflation, of course. The diplomat didn't laugh. But here's the moral ambiguity. Was Seward a visionary or a vulture? Was Russia a victim or a willing participant? The truth is both. Seward didn't force Russia to sell. He simply recognized their desperation and made an offer they couldn't refuse. Russia could have refused. They chose not to. The indigenous people of Alaska had no choice at all. That's the part history textbooks gloss over. The purchase was legal between two empires, but it was theft from the people who actually lived there. And neither Russia nor America faced accountability for that. The Alaska Purchase isn't just history, it's a blueprint. Right now, nations in financial distress are selling off strategic assets to survive. In 2016, Greece sold its largest port, Piraeus, to China for $368 million. Greece needed cash to service its debt. China needed Mediterranean access for its Belt and Road Initiative. In 2021, Sri Lanka, unable to repay Chinese loans, handed over operational control of Hambantota port to China for 99 years. The lease is irreversible. In 2023, Argentina negotiated with Britain over the Falkland Islands, not for sovereignty, but for resource-sharing agreements. Argentina is bankrupt. Britain has leverage. The mechanism is identical. Financial desperation, strategic asset sale, irreversible transfer of power. And the buyer is always patient. China is doing today what America did in the 19th century, waiting for fiscal crises, offering loans that can't be repaid, converting debt into territorial control. They call it debt trap diplomacy. Seward would have called it smart business. But here's the darker pattern. The countries being exploited are often former colonies themselves, nations that never fully recovered from European imperialism, nations with weak institutions, corrupt leadership, and populations that have no say in these decisions. The Alaska model works because it preys on systemic vulnerability. And the vulnerability never goes away. It just shifts. Today, it's not land being sold. It's ports, mineral rights, digital infrastructure, data networks. The commodity changes, the pattern doesn't. And the people living in those places, the ones whose resources are being sold, they're still not being asked. Just like the Tlingit in 1867, William H. Seward bought Alaska for 2 cents an acre because he understood something fundamental about power. Empires don't fall overnight. They bleed slowly, and if you're watching carefully, you can catch the blood. Russia sold Alaska because they thought survival mattered more than territory. They were wrong. 50 years later, they collapsed anyway. And America became a superpower by accumulating the pieces empires couldn't afford to keep. That's not conquest, that's patience. But it raises a question we should be asking today. When your country is in crisis, when debt becomes unsustainable, when infrastructure crumbles, when bills come due, what will you sell to survive? And who will be waiting, checkbook ready, to buy it for pennies on the dollar? Because the Alaska model never stopped working. It's happening right now. You just don't see it yet. If you want to understand how modern power actually works, how nations rise by exploiting the desperation of others, subscribe. Follow the patterns, watch the mechanisms, because history doesn't repeat, but the math always does.